Welcome to History 386, the United States, Poverty in the Midst of Prosperity. This is week 1. A note on photo sources in this PowerPoint. All photo sources used are copyright-free Google.com images or copyright-free clip art unless otherwise marked. Now, disclaimer. Online classes, because of their very nature, are demanding. They require a great deal of self-discipline and self-motivation. In addition to this fact, this is an accelerated 8-week course. That means that we will be covering the equivalent of what we usually cover in a 16-week course in 8 weeks. So if you like to read and you like to research and you like to write, then you'll find this, I think, a very engaging course. Now, because we are not meeting in a face-to-face format, that means that we need to leave the lines of communication open in other ways. Please know that I absolutely love teaching. I'm the recipient of quite a number of teaching awards, including a regional teaching award. So I'm always here to help you if you have concerns or questions. And I always want you to feel free to email me. My email is listed there, or to call my cell phone, which is listed there as well as on the syllabus. I usually try to check my email, well, as long as I'm feeling well and I'm not sick or anything like that, I'm checking my email very, very frequently. So you'll be pleasantly surprised at my response time most of the time. I do not use text messaging, however. It's not a part of my cell phone contract. Now, it's very important for you. The first step is to listen to this lecture, and after the lecture's over, make certain, if you've not already done so, to go to the syllabus on the Blackboard site for this class, to download it, to print it, and to become very familiar with all parts of the syllabus. We're not going to explain all parts of the syllabus in this lecture. However, we are going to discuss assignments. There is an icebreaker assignment worth 20 points, which is discussed in your syllabus. And there will be 7 discussions of 100 points each for a total of 700 points. And a final reflective paper of 100 points. Now that all adds up to 820. I include self-service extra credit, literally built-in extra credit. So if you look down here, actually your score is going to be taken out of 800 points. So an 800 is a perfect score. It is an A. But what I actually do is put 20 points in there. So you could actually, you don't need extra credit because the extra credit is built in. In essence, the icebreaker is the extra credit. So make certain that you do the icebreaker, because not only does it introduce you to me and to everyone else, but also it's your extra credit, and you never know when you might, in fact, need that extra credit. Now, the first kind of a disclaimer, the Blackboard system is confused by my built-in extra credit. So at any particular time, maybe you think you're actually getting an A, and it might say that you're getting an A- because it's basing everything on 820 points, as if 820 were a perfect score. But actually, 800 is a perfect score. So since it can't figure this out, if you're going along in the class in your 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th week in, and you're concerned, the Blackboard site seems to say one thing and your chart seems to say another, then just get a hold of me and we can clarify things for you. As I said, there'll be 7 discussion boards, and these are outlined in the assignment section of the syllabus, and also under the weekly assignments link on the Blackboard site, the class Blackboard site. The professor, in all instances, I will create the discussion thread with a prompt and/or prompts. The first student to reply to my thread should comment thoughtfully on at least one of those prompts. At any time, students can continue with that prompt or can introduce topics of their own. Please note that I've set up the Blackboard discussion site so that I create the discussion thread. You do not have the ability to create your own threads in this particular class. Now, since the discussion thread is already set, then you need to do two things. You need to click reply, and then you're writing your discussion up in a Word document, I assume. Then you're going to upload, you're going to kind of cut and paste. First of all, you're going to upload your 500-word discussion in a Word or RTF file as an attachment using that little paperclip icon. I need that attached file in Word so that I can grade your personal discussion post and return the discussion to you with any changes so that you'll be able to see those. In addition, besides uploading that as an attachment, you need to cut and paste out of that 500-word discussion in using Word or whatever other program you're using. You need to cut and paste that directly into the space provided in the discussion thread. And that is so that all the other students will have an easier time of reading the discussion post without having to open everyone's individual Word attachments, which can be very confusing and very time consuming. So two processes. You need to upload an attachment, a Word attachment, and secondly, then you also cut and paste that exact same thing you uploaded and put it directly into the space. And always remember to click submit so that it finishes the process. Discussions are usually due on Sundays by 11:59, 1 minute before midnight. But I encourage you to keep on a schedule. The schedule is designed to help you to complete the class in a timely manner and to not get behind. However, I realize that, life happens. Many of you are working adults, adult students. Some of you have families and children and all kinds of social and parental and other obligations, so I understand if you fall behind. Please know, I always accept late assignments, and I never deduct points for their being late. However, I do encourage you to only do that when it's absolutely necessary, because it is an 8-week class and you don't want to fall behind on your work. Now, the weekly discussions are graded in a very simple fashion. And I've put them in 4 different rows. And one, it's 20 points, this first row. And 10 points of that is, basically you're taking the assigned readings, the readings that I have assigned for that week, either in your required text or in any PDF uploads of other readings. And I want you to read those and understand those, okay? And so that's 10 points, evidence of having read and understood the assigned readings. And then in addition to that, I want you to make a reference, an in-text note, to at least one of those assigned readings. And we're going to discuss here in a minute what an in-text note is. It's like a footnote, except it's in the body of the text that you're writing, of the discussion that you're writing. 30 points. In addition to reading the assigned readings, I want you to find yourself to read and understand something which I have not assigned. That is, an unassigned reading of your choice. And I want this to come from a scholarly source, so I don't want you to go and use a .com website or Wikipedia. I don't want you to use Encarta, Britannica, not a dictionary, not the Bible, Quran, or other kind of book. So you need to find, in addition to the assigned readings, at least one unassigned reading, and it needs to be scholarly, and I'm going to show you how to do that here in a few minutes. Now, just as you did an in-text note for the assigned readings, I want you to do at least one in-text note for your unassigned reading. So your discussion will need to have at least 2 in-text notes. One from the assigned readings and the other from the readings that you choose, the readings that you research and read, the readings that you find what we call the unassigned reading. Now, because in-text notes do not give all of the details of, the author and title and all the other things that one needs to know. I also want you to give a short bibliography. That bibliography might only have one item in it, and that would be your unassigned reading. And I'm going to show you how to do a bibliography here also in this lecture in a few moments. So 10 points, 10 points, 10, 10, and 10, that's 50 of the points. Let's go over to this column. In this column, we have objectivity, critical thinking, and originality, each worth 10 points. The idea is to read your readings, that is, those that are assigned, as well as the unassigned readings, and to understand the material fully and to objectively look at them. So we might come to many of our discussions, and we're going to look at this also in this lecture in a minute, with certain prejudices in mind. And it's important as historians, just as it's important in any discipline, academic discipline, in a university setting, to try to consider all sides of the argument, to try and be as objective as possible. Use of critical thinking skills is evidenced by analysis and synthesis of the material. We will discuss that in a minute as well. Originality. That is, contributing to the discussion through thoughtful analysis and synthesis rather than simply repeating what a prior class member has already stated. This is very important. So when you do your discussion posting, you're going to have read all of the discussions that came prior to your posting. And of course, you read through them very quickly and you see if anyone has said something in particular, then you want to shy away from that. And, that doesn't mean that you can't deal with the same topic. It doesn't mean that you can't even use sometimes some of the same evidence. But what it does mean is you simply cannot repeat what someone else has said, what a prior student has said in the discussion board. What you want to do is to contribute something new, something that you read, maybe perhaps that you read in your unassigned reading. It could be something that you read in the assigned reading that no one else is really picking up. You can also actually kind of turn to a new topic of discussion and introduce that. So you have a great deal of flexibility where you're not tied into, you're not forced into a corner here. You have plenty of flexibility to discuss anything that happens to be in those readings or in the research that you've conducted. This last column is really following instructions. So 5 points, proper grammar and spelling. It's important for us to have good grammar and spelling so that we can actually convey what we mean. If we use improper grammar and spelling, sometimes we're not very clear in how we convey things. At least 500 words in length, and note that if it's really, really short, I can take off categories, points in other categories and other columns, because obviously if it's too short, you're not doing some of these other things completely. 5 points, cutting, pasting your essay into the discussion board, and 5 points, uploading your essay as a Word attachment. Now, we discussed critical thinking, and sometimes I think we need to define what we mean, especially in terms of the discussions in critical thinking. Critical thinking to me is really, connecting the dots. When you're a little kid and you have these little connecting the dots kind of puzzles, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And then all of a sudden at the end of it, you see the whole entire picture. This is like, you're reading the readings that I assigned, you're listening to my lecture, you're doing some of your own research, that is unassigned readings, and all of those things are those little dots, and you are going to then take what you've all done in my lectures and assigned and unassigned readings, and you're going to connect all the dots. That's what we call synthesis. So this synthesis is the part of critical thinking. It literally means to piece together. Synthesis means to piece together. So you're taking all of these separate dots and you're connecting the dots. You're taking all these separate pieces of the puzzle and you're connecting the puzzle. Now, just because you've put the pieces together doesn't mean that your audience, and your audience, by the way, is me, and it is your fellow classmates in the discussion board. It doesn't mean that we're going to take your word for it. Prove it, we'll say. Make us see how it all fits together. And that's where analysis comes in. And when you analyze something, so you just put it all together, you've put the pieces together. Now, in essence, you're showing the complete puzzle, but you're showing how you put the parts of the puzzle together, and you're explaining that to someone else. And sometimes that doesn't mean you take the whole puzzle apart. Sometimes you're only looking at a small part of the puzzle, and that's what you're going to do in a 500-word discussion. You can't summarize all of the readings in a 500-word discussion posting. The best you can do is just deal with a couple of the little puzzle pieces, but you can show us how they fit into the whole. And how you do that is you explain step by step using evidence. You lead your audience to your conclusion by using evidence. So, I like this little diagram. The claim, what do you know? Evidence is, how do you know that? And reasoning is, why does your evidence support your claim? And that's your explanation. That's critical thinking. So you need to use your reasoning. That is your critical thinking skills. Explained in another way, critical thinking is like learning how to ride a bike or how to swim or how you do anything in life. It takes a coach like me and practice, but the coach, that is I can't ride the bike for you. I can't swim for you. I can't critically think for you. I can kind of show you how to do it and guide you along, but it takes practice, 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 hence the 7 discussion boards. So to kind of review this whole thing, the lectures and the assigned readings give you the initial pieces of the puzzle. So it is vitally important for you to listen to the lectures that I have on the Blackboard site and to do the assigned readings. Those give you the pieces of the puzzle. Your research and reading, that is your chosen unassigned source, gives you more pieces of the puzzle. Then, when you go to do the discussion, my prompt or prompts will provide you with a sense of what the puzzle picture might look like after you assemble the pieces. And by the way, you're also assembling the pieces as you're reading all of this. And as you're reading one thing after another, and it might be, over 100 pages, and you say to yourself, I see how all the dots are connecting. I see how to synthesize it. I see the big picture from all the many tiny pieces. Now you need to show me, your readers, your classmates in the discussion what the assembled puzzle looks like and describe to them how you put the pieces together by using evidence. So if you need any more clarification on that, feel free to email me or call me. As I say, you need an example of an in-text footnote. And in-text footnotes are really simple, or they're sometimes just called in-text notes. In this example, we're taking from this particular paragraph here a bunch of information and we're summarizing it. And since it's dealing with all kinds of data, and this is the kind of data that, we needed to look up, we needed to research, it needs to have an in-text footnote, even though I'm not quoting this verbatim, that is word for word. An in-text footnote uses parentheses. So, opening parentheses, McKay, the last name of the author. There's no punctuation, but just a space. The year of publication of the work, a comma, a space, and then the page number where you found the information or where you're quoting from verbatim, and then close parentheses. It's as simple as that. Now remember, you need to do 2 in-text footnotes in each discussion for this class. 1 on the assigned readings and 1 on your unassigned readings. Plagiarism. I'm not going to go over this, word for word, because I'm going to allow you to print this off and to read it. But whenever you quote or use something verbatim, word for word, you need to put that quote in quotation marks and cite it with a note footnote is the same thing as an in-text note, by the way. If you paraphrase another person's unique ideas, their themes, their thesis, maybe stuff they've been working on for years, decades, you need to put that in a footnote, even if it's not word for word. If you use somebody else's tables or graphs or photographs, you need to cite that. And of course, you should never use another student's paper or presentation or one from a website, one that you buy, one that you get free. And the other reason for that is I will be checking all of the assignments, both the all 7 of the discussions and the final reflective paper, and I will be checking them for plagiarism, and we have all kinds of sophisticated software that helps us to do that. And in fact, you'll be able to see if there's anything that you've accidentally plagiarized. Avoiding plagiarism is very simple. So if you would take something and just put it verbatim, word for word, and you're taking it out of a source, then obviously you would need to put it in quotation marks and give in our class an in-text note. In other classes, it's going to look like a footnote. Avoiding plagiarism examples, if you have a really, really long quote, then what you actually have to do is a block quotation. In a block quotation, you actually begin the quote on a new line. You do not have to put quotation marks around it, but you single space, not double space, the long quote. You indent the entire quote, and you could include a note. And this is what a block quotation looks like. Okay? Looks like a little block. Now, even if you're just paraphrasing not generally known facts or statistics, like this: Asia's population increased in the period 1750 to 1900, blah, blah, blah. Well, no one walks around knowing that kind of information. So that's the kind of thing that you got from data out of a book, and you need to footnote. Now, widely known, widely disseminated, or generally known information, you don't have to footnote. And here are some examples of stuff that you would not need to put a footnote, that is, put an in-text note for. Obviously, if you were using a graph or some kind of photograph out of a book, that would require a note as well. Now, a bibliography, which you need for each discussion, and as I said, that bibliography might only have one unassigned reading in it, but you need it nonetheless. Each and every discussion needs one. A bibliography is a list of sources used given at the end of the paper and includes all kinds of important information, like the author's first and last name, the title of the book or title of the article, the place of publication, the publisher, the date of publication, the page numbers that you're referring to. And in history, we use what's called the Chicago, sometimes also referred to as the Turabian style. I want you to use that style, and it's very, very easy. If you go to a place called www.citationmachine.net, and it will actually help you to correctly format your bibliographic references. And you can experiment with that on your own. See also examples of bibliographic citations at the end of this lecture PowerPoint. I want to continue on with the flow of the material, and at the end we'll look at those very quickly. So you can always take those examples and again print them off or look at them when you need to. So you've got assigned readings and you have unassigned readings. How do you find acceptable sources for your discussion? Well, I suggest the NKU Steely Library database. And whenever you use those databases, you're obviously going to have to go to the library's website, and it's usually going to ask you for your username and your password. And then if you'll find usually in the upper right-hand corner a drop-down list, and sometimes you might want to go to things like Library Steely. Click on Databases. And I suggest these 3 databases, which are commonly used in history and the humanities. The first one is JSTOR, the Scholarly Journal Archive. And it literally stands for Journal Storage. And you can go in there and put in whatever topic you're looking at, whichever topic kind of interests you as you're looking at the discussion postings or as you're reading over the discussion material. Another similar site through the Kentucky Virtual Library is Academic Search Complete, and another one is called Project Muse. So all of these can be very useful databases, and you can find scholarly journal articles, which is what I really would prefer you using. Now, starting in week 6, we're going to shift from history to recent times in this class, and discussion 6 will deal with virtual role-playing, where you'll be asked to examine current resources to alleviate poverty in the community where you live. For those living in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, Southeastern Indiana, which is the metropolitan Cincinnati area, I provide a lengthy list of websites of community agencies at the end of the syllabus for this class. However, this is not an exhaustive list, and you're free to choose others not on the list. For those living elsewhere in the United States, please find agencies in your particular area. For those living overseas, please consult agencies anywhere you last lived or perhaps lived the longest when you were residing in the United States. Now, we're going to start, now that we got the business of things over, and we know that the major business are those discussions, we're going to start a little bit of background about me and the very important overview lecture on poverty in general in the United States. How I became interested in poverty studies. I met some years ago Helen McNeve Tyson, she's here on the left, and Rosemary McNeve, her sister, on the right. These two phenomenal sisters were very involved in philanthropic enterprises in Covington, Kentucky, that is in northern Kentucky, and in Cincinnati. Helen Tyson in 1960 was serving as the president, the national president of the National Council of Catholic Women. The National Council of Catholic Women in the United States in 1960 had 13,000 chapters nationwide and over 9 million women who were members. They were going to have their annual convention in Las Vegas, Nevada that year. And Helen Tyson, as president of the National Council of Catholic Women, worked with a lady called Eileen Egan. And Eileen Egan was with Catholic Relief Services in Washington, D.C. And Eileen Egan was very impressed by a little nun who lived in India, and her name was Mother Teresa. Now, this is very significant because Mother Teresa was not really well known at all outside of India, outside of Calcutta. And in fact, Mother Teresa was born in Albania. She decided to become a sister, and she went to train in Ireland. And then in 1929, she went to India. From the time she set foot in India in 1929 until 1960, she had never left India, ever. Never gone abroad. It was the National Council of Catholic Women and Helen McNeve Tyson and Eileen Egan who brought Mother Teresa to their national convention in Las Vegas in 1960, and it was called Women in the 60s. And basically, they introduced Mother Teresa to the United States, and from that point on, to the rest of the world. Helen McNeve Tyson, my friend, who I got to know some years later, was not only a wonderful woman, she became a very good friend of Mother Teresa. She even served as a consultant to Mother Teresa on a number of projects, including when Mother Teresa decided to open basically a hospice for people suffering from AIDS in New York City. And also a consultant when Mother Teresa sent some of her sisters down to the mountains of Kentucky, then a part of the Diocese of Covington. I was fortunate enough to meet Mother Teresa in 1982 when she came to northern Kentucky and to Kentucky to visit her new sisters in the missions in the mountain. It was a very, very moving experience. And of course, Mother Teresa is known worldwide for her care of the poor and unfortunate, basically for all those suffering from all kinds of things. And you can read this at your leisure. It's from Mother Teresa, The Joy in Loving. My interest in poverty studies continued in some of my research, especially when I began to write with Dr. Brian Hackett to research an exhibit and a book on St. Elizabeth Hospital, St. Elizabeth Medical Center, which is the largest employer in northern Kentucky. And found out the true way that the hospital was formed through the philanthropic work of two wonderful women, Henrietta Esther Scott Cleveland and Sarah Worthington King Peter, both of whom were very wealthy, but had suffered a number of trials and tribulations in their lives. In the instance of Henrietta Cleveland, the death of both of her sons, the death of her husband, and Sarah Worthington King Peter, the death of two husbands, etc. And so instead of just disappearing from the world and feeling sorry and pity for themselves, they began to serve their community and help to found hospitals, Sarah Worthington King Peter in Cincinnati, and also in Covington, and helping Henrietta Esther Scott Cleveland establish St. Elizabeth Hospital. This and other research that I've done, historical research, other work that I've done with poverty in the community, has made me an adherent of trying to understand historically how we've looked at poverty in the United States. So basically, we're starting at the end. This class examines poverty, prosperity, and the economic development of the United States. It's impossible to discuss any of the above topics, especially from the 19th century to the present day, without discussing the global economy. Hence, we'll be discussing topics such as industrialization, urbanization, imperialism, and globalization. And I have written as well, researched and written nationally on things like industrialization and urbanization. These intricate connections mean that we'll be referring quite often to other parts of the world. World News Today, in fact, is filled with references to the global economy, particularly about the growing inequality gap, both within individual nations and between nations. Whether you're conservative, liberal, or right in the middle, you depend upon the economy, the global economy, for more than you may realize. All of us benefit when the economy works well, and all of us suffer when it does not. This course is designed to introduce you to the terminology, the history, the themes, even the rhetoric of the arguments made by many different voices in many different viewpoints on the economic stage. In order to assure that we're all on the same playing field, I'm going to introduce you to some vocabulary and concepts in this first lecture. These modern-day terms and concepts will underlay our historical framework, so it's important to deal with them right away. Sit back, listen, and read, and let the terms and concepts sink in. Now, please know they won't all sink in at once. You'll hear and read them again and again, so don't worry if they seem foreign or strange to you now. By the end of this class, it will all start to come together, and maybe even before. And guess what? Many, if not most, of those historic economic explanations and theories were focused on one cause, one problem, one solution, one silver bullet to fix it all. However, history and the economy are both very complex things. If there were a silver bullet to solving poverty, millions of human beings would have discovered it by now. So let's throw aside our collective hubris and admit that all of us, including me, have much to learn. In other words, if you think you have all of the answers, you're probably not asking the right questions. To ask the right questions, we need to realize that history is the study of change over time and place. Hence, number one, our questions and themes change depending upon the historical period that we're discussing. The questions, in fact, may change dependent upon which civilization or nature or culture we are discussing. We're going to be discussing American civilization, that is U.S. civilization, and understanding it like all civilization as humankind's attempt to bring stability and meaning to an uncertain and changing world. You know, if the world were able on its own to provide us with stability and meaning and no change, we wouldn't have to worry about economic depressions and recessions and employment and unemployment and poverty. Now, I often say, usually in all of my classes, that successful civilizations monitor their political and military conditions, and these would include economic conditions, that they recognize and reward leaders, and that those leaders tend to be flexible in their response to changing conditions and learning from their mistakes. The complete opposite is true of unsuccessful civilizations, which are out of touch with reality, and their leaders tend to be inflexible or complacent, and they do not learn from their own mistakes. So sometimes, and you're going to see this with nations and empires in general, that this kind of implosion can occur. This internal weakness compounded by external problems. And you're going to see this at certain times with some of the economic depressions, whether they begin in the United States, as many of them did. They certainly are going to be compounded, made worse by international trade situations. Especially, we're going to describe this in the Great Depression of the 1930s. As Dr. Tenkate states, bad leaders seldom learn from their own mistakes and or often blame others for their mistakes. Mediocre leaders sometimes learn from their own mistakes. Good leaders learn from their own mistakes as well as from the mistakes of others. One of the first things that we have to consider when we consider poverty and prosperity in the United States is, where does the United States fit on this continuum? On the one side, we have communalism, the importance of harmony, group decision-making, consensus culture. Over here, the importance of the individual. I left that term out. Individual decision-making and majority rules culture. In the United States, we tend to be more over here, that we're more individualistic. We believe, rightly or wrongly, in kind of rugged individualism, that we make our own lives and choose our own lives and make our own choices and determine whether we will be successful economically, and socially in our lives. Communalism over here would be more like China or Japan or India, places that generally we would say are very much concerned with the harmony of the group. The group makes decisions, and if the individual stands out too much, the individual gets kind of knocked right back down. Those societies have a different framework of looking at life. Somewhere in the middle, probably Europe, which has more of a sense of communalism, of group, of the importance of groups, but still is capitalistic and still has individualism as part of it. I mean, individualism grew out of the Enlightenment, which came out of Europe. It grew out of the Renaissance, which came before the Enlightenment. So where does the U.S. fit on this continuum? And the continual question you want to have back in the back of your mind is, when causes of poverty and possible remedies to poverty are mentioned, and somebody says they work here or they work there, they work in Europe, constantly kind of thinking in the back of your mind, would they work in the United States, or would it take an entire readjustment of the entire social outlook, our social framework, our perspective of the way we look at ourselves and the way we look at others and the way we involve and regard our culture. So it's always very important to keep these kinds of things back in mind. Now, any one of these things can have their own inherent, that is, built-in dangers. If you have too much communalism, the individual can be ignored. And if you have too much individualism, well, then selfishness and greed and just downright anarchy can end up resulting. So both of these two extremes can be dangerous, and it's always important to kind of realize what is possible within a particular culture, say, for instance, the U.S. culture. Who are the poor? Defining poverty or prosperity throughout history is like trying to hit a moving target. Before the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century, that is of the 1800s, the vast majority of people in any nation or civilization were poor peasant farmers, as high as 90% or more. By our modern standards, we would regard those overworked people as poor, living in hovels, eating porridge, and dying young. But to them, they were not the poor, as there were others poorer than they were. On the other hand, the wealthy were living in stone houses, eating mutton, and had no understanding whatsoever of modern sanitary standards. They didn't take many baths. They didn't have proper sanitation. They had an outhouse out in the back. To us, the wealthy years ago, appear poor. Who are the poor? Well, we do know this, that throughout history, and sorry for the weird formatting here, throughout history, United States history, we've tended to regard people in three kind of different categories, the poor. The undeserving poor. So they're on the one end of the spectrum. Those are the kind of poor people that historically people looked at and said, well, they're just lazy. You know, they could get a job if they wanted to get a job, but they really don't want to. Or they have some sort of personal dilemma or problem that prevents them from advancing. And years ago, everybody would have stuck most alcoholics in this category. Today, we understand alcoholism as a disease. Back then, it was seen as being a bad habit. So it was regarded differently. The working poor are those who work, but they don't earn enough to really get by. And the deserving poor are people that we would say are like the aged, old people, widows, widowers, orphans, the chronically ill, the handicapped. And as you read your readings and listen to my lectures and do your research, not only is it important to keep in mind the big categories of communalism and individualism, but these big categories of who are we talking about? Are we talking about the undeserving poor, the working poor, or the deserving poor? Well, poverty is not easily defined. It can mean different things at different times. And to make matters even more complicated, measurements of poverty also vary. For a detailed discussion of the definition of poverty and its measurements, see your textbook readings for this week from John Iceland, Poverty in America, a Handbook. Now, another thing to keep throughout the extent of this class in your mind is this: poverty, causes, and remedies. Although many people today realize that there is no panacea, no one solution to poverty, historically people in the U.S. have debated its causes and its possible remedies. This course examines historical causes and remedies. And this lecture provides you with an overview of the historical remedies before the 1930s and hints to the presumed causal explanations. Through your readings and research, I want you to connect historical explanations of causes and remedies. So again, what are we keeping in mind? We're keeping in mind communalism and individualism. We're keeping in mind the undeserving poor, the working poor, the deserving poor. And we're keeping in mind that people in different time periods in United States history tended to blame certain things for poverty, or to say this, and this are causes of poverty. And hence, if those are causes of poverty, then this or this or this might remedy those causes of poverty. And not always am I going to give you, boom, in black and white, woo, here they are. These are the causes, these are the remedies. I'm giving you the overview. I'm giving you some of the pieces of the puzzle. And through your critical thinking, your assigned readings, your unassigned readings, through your discussion postings, you will come to see the relationship and connect the dots between causes and remedies, communalism and individualism, the deserving, the undeserving, and the working poor, and the different categories of what happens. Now, I'm going to give you 2 overviews of remedies to poverty in the United States in 2 major categories. The first of those major categories is before the Great Depression of the 1930s, before the New Deal of FDR, that is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that major category was that there were no federal programs for the aged, for widows, for the unemployed, for handicapped, for those injured on the job, etc., etc. Just no federal programs. There may have been some, few little programs here and there that some cities or some states had, or just general charities, churches, and charitable individuals would help people out. But the 2 giant categories of remedies to poverty in the United States have to be seen historically as number 1, before the Great Depression, and number 2, the New Deal and after, where there was an increasing federal role in poverty. So, you're keeping in mind undeserving poor, working poor, deserving poor. You're keeping in mind individualism and communalism. You're keeping in mind causes and remedies. And under remedies, 2 major categories. Before the Great Depression and the New Deal, and after the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now we're going to take, in this lecture, the first one, Roman numeral number 1, before the Great Depression, and break it down, that one category, into 4 subcategories. But first, we have to say something about classical economic theory. And this comes from a rather old book, one that I learned a lot of my economics from, Bradley Schiller's The Economy Today, but I haven't been able to find anything that explains it more succinctly or clearly, so we're going to keep with this older work. Prior to the 1930s, macroeconomists thought that there could never be a Great Depression. The economic thinkers of the time asserted that the economy was inherently stable. During the 19th century and the first 30 years of the 20th century, the U.S. economy had experienced some bad years, years in which the nation's output declined and unemployment increased. But most of these episodes were relatively short-lived. The dominant feature of the industrial era was growth. The economy self-adjusts, they thought, to deviations from its long-term growth trend. This kind of classical theory stretched all the way back to Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was written in the same year, 1776, as our American Revolution was underway and Declaration of Independence. Laissez-faire economics is what Adam Smith and the classical economic theory believed. Laissez-faire is a French term meaning to leave alone, that the government should leave alone the economy, that the economy should work on its own, that the forces of supply and demand in and of themselves, if things got bad and things went into depression, that they would right themselves, that they would fix themselves. This was the so-called invisible hand of economics. The invisible hand that you didn't see, but that would work, that would right, that would fix the wrongs in the system. In and of itself, Adam Smith was saying something, very modern at the time. He was basically saying all of the old systems of colonial empires where the government, like Great Britain, got involved in controlling everything for their own benefit and for monopolies and for the wealthy. That, he said, that didn't make any sense. That was the government interfering. That was wrong. The government needed to leave things alone. And this classical economic theory was very important, and it was vital to what happened in the first and second industrial revolutions, which we'll be discussing here in the next few weeks. Now, the four subcategories before the 1930s, Roman numeral 1A, outdoor relief and almshouses, poorhouses. From colonial times through the American Revolution to circa 1850, outdoor relief was the preferred method of helping the poor. That does not mean that they forced the poor to live outdoors. It means that cities and counties in the United States attempted to keep people living in their places of residence, that is, outside of an institution, by providing food, clothing, firewood, or small amounts of money. Excuse me, I will correct this in the PowerPoint. I misspelled this. It's an M before an S. Constant concern was leveled here between the deserving and the undeserving poor, but it was easier to administer and monitor back then, this outdoor relief, because there were fewer people. Now, outdoor relief and almshouses, poorhouses, from colonial times to circa 1850, some poor people, especially those without relatives or friends to care for them, were sent to almshouses or poorhouses. Almshouses and poorhouses often were located in rural areas and included working farms where the able-bodied residents were required to work for their room and board. These early poorhouses included everyone under one roof: widows, orphans, children, the healthy and the sick, the handicapped and the able-bodied, even the mentally ill. Can you imagine what kind of places these would have been? Second category, 1B, specialized institutions. By the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, poorhouses were replaced by more specialized institutions, for example, where a more suitable environment would be provided. So there were orphanages, not only for orphans, but for children who their parents simply no longer could afford to take care of, or perhaps one of the parents died. If a father, for instance, died, a mother might have to send her kids or some of her kids to the orphanages. My great-grandfather, his wife died, and when that happened, he had a number of children. He would take the oldest boy to work with him to sweep things up and do little odd jobs, but the rest of the children he had to put in an orphanage until he remarried, and then he picked them back up. Widows' homes, especially for widows. Old age homes for those who were aged. Hospitals for people who didn't have really communicable diseases or very contagious diseases. Special infirmaries for those who did have contagious diseases like, cholera, tuberculosis. Insane asylums for the mentally ill. Special residential schools for the blind and deaf. These were the specialized institutions which replaced the all-for-one, everybody under one roof, almshouses and poorhouses that clearly did not work. 1C, scientific charity. By the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, as science advanced rapidly in the U.S., other professions like social work began to emerge. These professions tried to apply scientific principles to their professions. That is the scientific method. Hypotheses led to testing and social experiments, etc. Scientific charity, as it was called, look at both parts of that. It included the need to be scientific and also the need to be private charity. So the stress was not on the government, but on private charity. And in its scientific outlook, it did something which we almost regard as unthinkable. But they tried it. It was an experiment. It was a social experiment. It didn't work. We don't do it anymore. That is, they broke up families. Family breakup. For instance, sending children to orphanages was seen as preferable to keeping them in homes broken by poverty, disease, death, alcoholism, or any kind of other reasons. The fourth and final subcategory before the 1930s, 1D, child saving and progressivism. The big change here was the economic depression of 1893, during which unemployment reached an estimated 17 to 19% of the workforce, and it became increasingly clear that even hard-working, frugal, and abstemious people could suffer poverty. Child saving was an attempt to keep children with worthy parents. That is, to seek preservation of the family unit. And it led to all kinds of things, like mothers' pensions, so that mothers wouldn't have to go out to work and leave their children behind with no child care programs, public health programs, juvenile courts, child labor laws, etc. We'll be learning about these more when we discuss progressivism. I like this little comic because it shows a line of people in the comforting lies. And over here, unpleasant truths, nobody's lined up. We all do this to ourselves. We don't like to hear unpleasant truths. And so this is the part of the lecture where we have to discuss a few unpleasant truths. Prejudice literally means to prejudge. That is, to judge before you have all of the evidence, all of the facts. This is largely emotionally based, not rationally based. We, as academics, want to make certain that we are as objective as possible, that we get the facts, that we get the evidence, and we try desperately not to let our emotions get involved. Privilege means to have an exceptional right or privilege. That is, something which not everyone else has. Power can mean many things: political, economic, or social control. Now, these three things can go together and produce a very unhealthy thing in society, in human beings, etc. And I'm going to give you actually a very personal example of when I suffered from GERD. GERD is gastroesophageal reflux disease, which basically means that, all of us have this little kind of sphincter muscle which separates our stomach from our esophagus. And when we eat food, that sphincter opens up so that the food can go down and enter into the stomach. And when we're done, it's supposed to close up so that the acids in the stomach stay in the stomach where they belong and don't go, right on up the esophagus and cause troubles like cancer and so forth. Well, I suffered from some really bad GERD, and I tried all kinds of medicines and so forth, and I was almost just wondering, should we just go ahead and have some surgery? And the doctor I was going to, the gastroesophageal doctor, one time was asking me, did he think, he knew I was a professor and a kind of a thinking person, did I somehow think that maybe I had some nervous problems or a lot of stress in my life? Well, I answered him and said, well, I do have a lot of stress in my life. My job was very stressful at the time. I did not like my job at the time. And my mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And in fact, I was in a major accident, the victim of a major accident, which shut down Interstate 75 for 2 hours. There were a lot of things going on in my life that were adding to my stress level. And so he asked this question, so I responded truthfully to him. And from that point in time, he seemed to think that perhaps I was maybe a hypochondriac, a nervous person, that maybe it was all in my head. And so we tried medicine after medicine, and he just kind of refused to believe that it was all that bad. So finally I'd had enough. Now, where this all enters in is this doctor, despite his academic training and, the fact that he's a medical doctor, despite all of that, he had used his own prejudice to prejudge that perhaps my problem was more nerves related, emotionally related than actually, physiological. He used his prejudice, and then he used his privilege as a doctor to kind of make that determined. So, I am his patient. I look up to him as my doctor, having all this background and this study and schooling. And he kind of used that as a privilege of his and was kind of trying to use it to overpower our decisions on what would be best for my health. And if I had let him do that, I probably would have had esophageal cancer by now and died. But instead, I said, this doctor is not doing me any good, and I did a lot of research and a lot of homework, and I found another doctor, and we underwent extensive tests, and that doctor was appalled at the problems, the physiological problems with the sphincter, and how he said it was like the size of a quarter, and how I could hardly keep anything down, and that we needed to do some rather radical and immediate surgery to fix the problem, which we did. When I asked for my medical records to bring him to this new doctor, I found evidence in those records of his suspicions that somehow I was, I'll just say this, some kind of a nutbag, some kind of hypochondriac. See how prejudice and privilege, if it's used to empower someone and to take power away from someone, can be a very dangerous thing. This is true of anything in life, but this especially can be true in terms of racism, and racism has been connected to poverty in the United States. It was there when the slaves themselves were impoverished. It was there throughout early immigrant groups coming to the United States, through anti-Semitism, through anti-Catholicism, through know-nothingism, nativism, etc. And so it's something that we have to deal with. Racism is clearly more than simple prejudice or bigotry, Joseph Barnes said. Everyone is prejudiced. Everyone. But not everyone is racist. To be prejudiced means to have opinions without noting the facts, and to hold on to those opinions even after contrary facts are known. To be racially prejudiced means to have distorted opinions about people of other races. Racism is the power to enforce one's prejudices. More simply, racism is prejudice plus power. And I will add, and this is in the literature as well, racism is very often prejudice plus privilege plus power. That's another thing we need to keep in mind. Now, we need to do some definitions. And this is the last part of the lecture. Economic terminology. Definitions are crucial. We need definitions in order to discuss anything in life, and especially to debate topics. An apple is not an orange, so we need to be able to define each one of those. So let's look at the definition first of capitalism. And this is still the best definition I can find. An economy in which the factors of production, that is land and capital, are owned by individuals, and by extension, groups of individuals like corporations, companies, and the basic allocation decisions about those resources are made by market forces. That is, simply by the fact that supply and demand. Now, social market economy, or what is sometimes called social capitalism, is capitalism whereby the government provides very generous social benefits. A socialist market economy has some market mechanisms plus socialism. Socialism is an economy in which all non-labor means of production are owned by the state. By the state we mean government, which exercises control over resource allocation. Communism, according to Karl Marx, is where the government would cease to exist because everyone would be equal and there would be no classes and no class struggle. I have taken it and put it all in a handy-dandy little diagram for you, which shows that you can go back and forth between the two. And here on the left, appropriately, I have communism. And the only place we've ever really seen sort of communism, and that's why I put it kind of here in the middle and not way over here, this line, is utopian communities like New Harmony in Indiana, well known in American history, or, the different Shaker communities, etc., those utopian communities. Socialism, where the means of production, land and capital are owned by the state, that is by the government, That's the old USSR. That's the old Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Socialism. A socialist market economy is easily understood if you just think of today's People's Republic of China. A social market economy is much of today's Europe. They have a free market, they have supply, they have demands, but they have many more regulations on corporations and business, and sometimes they actually support and advance those businesses like Airbus and so forth, and provide generous R&D, research and development funds. And then capitalism over here on the right, and I put on the very right that U.S. 19th century, and of course, since the New Deal in the 1930s, the U.S. today is not way over here on the right. It's not a social market economy by any means, but it's not pure capitalism either. In fact, there's really no place in the world that is pure capitalism, and there really hasn't been hardly any place in the world that was pure, capitalism. More economic terminology. Gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services produced within a country. For example, in terms of the United States, all goods and services produced within the U.S., regardless of whether the producer is a U.S. firm or a foreign one located here, whether it's an American worker or a national residing here. And it consists of 4 different categories in case you want to know. So the Toyota plant in Georgetown, Kentucky, Honda plant in Maryville, Ohio, etc. These are examples of part of the U.S.'s gross domestic product, even though it's Toyota and Honda, which are owned by companies elsewhere. Now, the gross domestic product, the GDP rank order. This is from February of 2016. The largest GDP is China. China is now the world's largest economy. The European Union, or the EU, is now the world's second largest economy. The United States has dropped to third. Up in the ranks is India, down in the rankings, Japan, down in the rankings, Germany, and you can see the top 15. There's also a difference between current or nominal GDP, which is given in current prices, or real GDP, which is prices adjusted for inflation. There's also GDP per capita, so a country's GDP divided by its population. So, China has 1.3 billion people, but it has this amount of economy. The United States has this economy, right, 17 trillion, but it only has, 315, 320 or so million. So the United States per capita, that is per person GDP, is higher than China's. However, the United States per capita GDP is not the highest in the world. There are many other countries that have a higher per capita GDP. We can talk about trade balance, which is simply a trade balance is simply number one of this. And that is, what is your exports in goods minus your imports in goods? In the case of the United States, it imports more than it exports, so we have a negative trade balance. This is kind of an old way of looking at an economy in terms of the global economy. The more current way is to use the current account balance, which includes this visible trade with invisible trade, which includes services. It also includes investments that we make abroad versus investments others make in our domestic economy. And in turn, it also includes unilateral transfers, which are transfers that people send back. For instance, a Mexican worker sending part of his American paycheck home, or the United States sending certain foreign aid abroad. Now, it's very important to look 2016 at the, I reversed those numbers, sorry, at the current account balance. the United States is running the world's largest deficit in terms of the current account balance. Almost $456 billion a year. China currently has the largest surplus, current account balance surplus, of $293 billion a year, followed a little bit under that by Germany of $275 billion a year, but on the entire European area, EU market is $343 billion, but again, that includes a number of countries. You can see other places like Russia and Switzerland and the Netherlands and South Korea have huge budget surpluses. Not budget, current account balance surpluses, excuse me. Now, one other thing that we have to look at is what is called the Gini index. And this is an index that looks at the inequality in income. You can look at inequality in income from many different economists worldwide that look at this for different organizations, nonprofit organizations. The nonprofit OECD, the organization, that's the British spelling, for economic cooperation and development, shows, and I just accessed this, that in terms of all of these countries here, and there are many here that are OECD countries, if you look, the closer they are to zero is the closer they are to complete equality. Obviously, nobody has complete equality. The closer they are to 1, the closer they are to complete inequality. So these are places where income is more equitably distributed and there's less of a gap between the very wealthy and the very poor. At the end where inequality is, you see the United States in blue at 0.39, followed by Turkey, and then you see at 0.457 Mexico. So the United States has, as we know, a great amount of income inequality. Another reason kind of to see how we got where we are today historically is to look at Cincinnati, right across the river, Ohio River from NKU. In terms of large U.S. cities, it has the second worst childhood poverty rate, which used to be over 50% and now has dropped under 50%, but still is one of the worst in the nation. I said I'd show you how to use bibliographies. This shows you. Second line is indented. We've got last name, author's last name, first name, italicized, the name of the book, place of publication, publisher, date, etc. I've got all kinds of examples of a book with multiple authors or editors or multiple editions, a dissertation, an article from scholarly journals, so many of you will be using this format when you find things on JSTOR and the like, a website, many of you will be using this when later on in week 6 and week 7 you look at some of the acceptable websites, book reviews, manuscripts, interviews. When in doubt, contact me. Look at the Chicago Manual style, be thorough, be consistent. Any questions? Please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a good week.